Okay, thank you, guys. Nice to meet you. My name is Marty Miller.
I'm Stephen.
Stephen Wong, everyone. Yes. All right. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in immersive play experiences at City University. And today I'll be talking a bit about the postdoctoral research work that I've been doing in the last couple of years. In my role as postdoctoral researcher, and
I'm a research assistant in CDU, which helps Marty to finish this project. I also want to give credit to Casper, which is our friends, who help us along the way.
so basically it's a team project. Thank you, guys. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting from a little bit of a different angle, more of a research angle that has like social implications. So it's a little bit of a less technical approach, but bear with us. There's still interesting tech implementation along the way. So the project is Redefining Play in Unconventional Spaces. So I'm going to break down what I'm talking about today kind of in these three parts. You'll see it on YouTube someday, most likely. The first part is like how we chose the space for play that we want to work with. The second is then like how do we actually work with the stakeholders that are associated with the site? Because when you're working with these social situations, it gets really complex. Then the third part is then how do we actually enable access to that experience for the participants and for the broader public? So the first thing that we're actually interested in here is in how people who share memories of the same space or same place, how can they use actually less accurate or inaccurate images to actually tell stories together? And the kind of inaccuracy that I'm talking about is going to become clear as we progress here. We're translating this kind of sensitivity into two questions. The first is what memories does a pictured physical space actually evoke when encountered through Gen AI content? That's the first hint about the value of the inaccurate picture here. The second question is, once we understand those kind of stories that they want to tell, then we translate to systems design. How do we actually design an immersive imaging system that actually activates the more intangible storytelling traits for people using that space? And the word intangible here is super important because what we're paying attention to all along the way is not the final artifact. It's not the sort of a picture or the told story that we're super interested in. It's more like what enables that to be possible. That's the intangible stuff that we're trying to capture here with the systems design. Part one, context and participants. So this is the Blue House. So this is in Wan Chai, downtown Hong Kong, and you probably know it. It's pretty famous because it's blue color, right? And it's really important to understand the context of it. You kind of have to understand what it was like before it was blue to see what's important about using it for a research site for an immersive play experience, okay? Quick history. It's 100 years old this year. It was built in 1926. And you can kind of see the first painting / photo that was made of it right there. Just going up from my left finger there is the oldest image of the Blue House. But it's important to remember that, well, in this context, it was super working class. So the people who lived there, they had better things to spend their money on than cameras to take pictures of their everyday lives, right? So for most of its history, it wasn't blue, no one cared. But then the impact of that was actually that, well, when it came time for the residents to remember their past history, they didn't have pictures or photographs to rely on, right? So their memories got associated with objects instead. And then the role of objects then became important because after it was painted blue in the 1990s, it started getting famous, right? And then people wanted to go there and take their pictures in front of it. And you can kind of see why. Because, you know, it's the only colorful building in the shot, right? But then, you know, of course, it gets more and more popular. The blue gets brighter and brighter. And then around 2011, it gets expanded and the population almost doubles. So now you have this weird mix of like families that have lived there for generations and a bunch of new people that moved in. And so you have these competing memories of the space, right? And at the same time, you don't have pictures of the past to validate what memory is true and what's not true. So that's kind of the context that we're dealing with here. And importantly, that small picture on the bottom right, they built their own in-house museum to kind of control the narrative about how they want to be represented to the community. Because most people, they go there and they just take a nice selfie in front of the shiny blue wall, right? So there is also this need to communicate to the broader public their own memories of their house. So they put their objects in that House of Stories museum. And then now, current, Blue House is overrepresented in Hong Kong. You can see in the MTR, in the Metro, it's like giant stickers of it, so it becomes iconic. And the sort of iconicity, as they say, is larger. It's more popular than the actual building in a way. You can even go online, you can look at all the hashtags, and you can see how ubiquitous it is in Hong Kong visual culture. So these are the reasons why we chose the site to work with. Basically, like, number one, there's a mixed population. There's a need for intergenerational memory transfer. People who are 95 years old are living next to someone who's 25 years old. They have vastly different memories of the same site, but maybe they don't. But how would they know? Because there's this generation gap there. So there's also a need to kind of bring people together to look at their experiences. The second one is there's few pictures that exist to validate memory. So the third is that there is the need to communicate their shared experience as Blue House residents to the outside world. So once we identified this site as an interesting site to work with, I went there for several months and did on-site observation using sort of social design, anthropological techniques, got to know some residents, got to know the site manager, tried to understand what their needs would be and how we could work together. What we came up with was basically doing these storytelling workshops, a whole series of them. And it was really analog at first. I printed out this like 3-meter long banner picture, right, of the exterior of the Blue House. And then we had these workshops inside the Blue House space itself. How it went was this was right when Photoshop released its early Firefly beta plugin, right, for its platform. It's sort of its text-to-image component, basically. So what we did is printed out the picture, brought the people in. Each resident was also paired with sort of a cultural liaison, someone who was multilingual and had had prior training in doing this kind of social work before. And their job was to help the residents kind of like translate their memory into a prompt. So what they did, the residents would come in, they would, start talking about what they noticed in the picture, and then eventually they would translate some memory into a prompt, and then they would go over to like an actual laptop, type in the prompt. It would actually print out the segment on a printer. It would kind of cut it out and then place it on the actual panorama to facilitate further storytelling. So that's the method that was used. Here's the information on the participants, and you can see that it's a super wide variety, like the oldest people are in their mid-90s, youngest people in their mid-20s. Yet here they are in the same room together, having to see how their memories work together, if at all. Now, this is an interesting snippet of memories that we actually decided to really grasp onto, because out of all the memories that were visualized, these were the ones that happened both spontaneously and collaboratively. So we didn't tell people to tell stories together, but because we were looking for what were the instances when they just happened to work together to manifest a memory, to visualize it. Basically, that little red icon, it says site-specific next to it. And that's a term that basically means that there's some kind of memory that's so hyper-local, that's so unique, that there's really no chance that it'd be able to be represented properly by a giant imaging model in this case. And this was important because this became our window for how we could use Gen AI in a way that actually facilitated memory recall rather than actually replacing people's memories. The next step that we did with this mountain of storytelling data where we had XY positions on the panorama, we had reported speech, we had direct speech, we had the segments that were generated, we had the prompts, we had feedback forms. Well, we went through it all. I did thematic coding, did some intercoder validation procedures, which is a way to sort of check to see if I'm understanding my own bias properly compared to other coders, what they found interesting in the data. And we basically condensed all of these experiences down into like 5 intangible attributes. And that means it's like 5 attributes that allow the story to exist, that allow the memory to manifest visually. So the thing that allows the thing to become tangible. And the first is super common sense. People needed to recognize something worth changing. They needed to have an image referencing procedure available to them. The second was that there was a verifying of memories by co-constructing details together. That means we had to allow multiple voices to speak at once. The third thing is that there was a condensing of shared memories into prompts. So we had to include a summarizing procedure in the system. The fourth is that there was a need to iteratively improve their outputs via feedback. So we had to allow for refining of generation choices. And the fifth was finally, people needed to be able to move their pictures around. So there had to be some sort of continuous repositioning that's possible. So after we got all that and we figured out what the affordances were, then it came down to actually designing the system and making it work. So this is in CityU's Gallery 360 Theater that belongs to the Center for Applied Computing and Interactive Media, where I do my postdoc. And basically here you can see how the intangible affordances map to the system affordances. And you can see that along the way, we actually had to implement these different kinds of procedures behind the initial display. So there's both controller tracking, there's speech to text going on, There's a segmentation model which breaks up the panorama into individual parts. There's also the image generation model going on. And then here's how the input structure works. So it was super important, we found out later, that we had to divide the selection input from the prompt input. So the selection input basically comes through this valve controller. There's a generate button, there's an undo and erase button, and a trigger selection button. But then also you can see there's a separate voice signal that comes in through your smartphone, through a URL where you can press a button to record a prompt in any language. It'll summarize what you said into something promptable. Now, another important attribute for this particular context was to include a physical book. And this kind of seems antithetical. Why would we put a book in a system like this, right? It's sort of a different kind of technology going on. But we have to remember the stakeholders are up to 90 years old. This is what they're used to for checking pre-existing information. So we installed a book in the theater as well that had the original collaborative storytelling instances mapped out with the prompt, with the conversation, with the keywords, as well as the storytelling area. And we did this because we kind of wanted to leave two different potentials for how people could interact with the space. They could view it as like a simple museum. I can come here and I can see what other people already generated and the stories they already told. Or it could be sort of an open world kind of thing where they could build on that, or they could just fantasize anything they wanted. We wanted to see how people used it then. There's a QR code there too if you want to download it later. And here you can see some people using it when the residents came back inside the theater. And very briefly, this is how it works. So we speak it into the smartphone.
I remember there was a stone canal running through the center of the street. And it had walls, and the walls were high, and the walls were also made of stone. And it was long and narrow, and it had water in the bottom of the canal. Yes, it had deep water.
It summarizes, and then once you finalize your prompt, boom, it pops up on your phone. And then basically you can start the generation process. So the latency takes about 30 seconds at this point. So there could be some dead air, but we found out that during the waiting time, there was a lot of stuff people wanted to talk about generally, right? And it was facilitated also because there was two input devices. So they were constantly seeing, who wants which one and what do they want to say next, right? There you go. There's also, an erase function, and then you can undo your erase, and the prompt stays there, so then you can regenerate it with the same prompt in a different location. Which satisfies the fifth intangible affordance. And voila, there it is. Okay, and then after we had the basics working, we brought user testers in. I think a couple of you guys were actually there doing user testing, and we got some very useful feedback. Some of it's common sense, some of it maybe not. The tutorial has to stay interactive, right? Yeah, Stephen slaved over that one. But then also, we realized how important it was to keep the pre-selected areas to signify the existing stories. Because we realized that, yes, we do need to make sure that people can interact with the scene both in a museum sort of sense, but then also in a free play open world way. And then finally, very small, simple corrections we had to make where in the panorama, there's a dividing line, right, where you cannot free select an area. So we had to signify that through making a red line over that part. Now, something else that really helped the experience was that we were using mask-guided in-painting. So basically what this is doing is when you're selecting an area, it's basically referencing a larger area, right? About 30% larger on average. So that means that whatever's generated inside the selection will have a little bit more context to make sure it generates photorealistically. It'll copy the correct lighting conditions, the correct depth of field, things like this. And this was really important. So if we go back to here, like how we found the value in using Gen AI for this kind of thing, right? Because again, we want to use it in a way that's not replacing people's memories, okay? It's not a prosthetic for people's memories, but rather we wanted to use it in a way that's like a prompt for people's memories. Like, how do you make it so that it makes people have to be more accurate with what they want to remember, rather than replacing what they want to remember? And it's a subtle thing. Again, here's the site-specific instance, Stone Canal, in front of the brew house. A lot of the older people remembered growing up there, playing around the canal, falling in, getting in trouble. It was a big part of their lives, right? So how do we represent this really strange thing that would not be in the model, because how many stone canals in the middle of the street do you know? Well, we did low-rank adaptation training is one way. So we found just enough archival images of this stone canal before it got covered up to basically train an adapter to make sure that the most common characteristics would still be represented. And one of the most common ones here is that this canal was in several stages. It wasn't contiguous. So we combined that with the prompt expansion techniques as well. So we have a sort of a semantic layer there that says whenever anyone says the word canal, that it would be automatically associated with the word straight or segment or Hong Kong street. And here you can kind of see pictures of how we were doing that in the process. And the result is something like this. So when you have your smartphone and you speak your prompt and then you generate it in the scene, that it'll probably come out something a little bit more similar to what the people actually remembered. But not perfect, because we wanted to make sure that it was still fantasizable. Like this person wanted to like fantasize a stone Loch Ness monster in the bottom of the canal coming out of it. And here you can see a little bit of what it was like when people mixed those different ways of approaching the system. Some of the things are integrated very well in the environment and it seems like they should be there. Other things like Michael Jackson absolutely should not be there, but you can make your own call on that. The point is that people were able to combine their motivations for what they wanted from the system in the same moment. And even across generations here, because it aided the process of, they wanted to be able to know how people got their street food accurately in the 1950s, at the same time that someone wanted to see what Spider-Man would look like hanging from the ceiling right outside the Blue House. So really interesting here, the sort of takeaways that we got from this process were that the Gen AI output can appear more real than memory, especially when it's kind of subjective and incomplete, and we're using the mask-guided in-painting technique. But at the same time, it also functioned as prompts for people's own personal memory recall. And that's what we were going for. We didn't want people to be like, I don't remember exactly what it was like. That's close enough. Okay. What we wanted to do was leave the base model so massive and not constrain it so that there would be a gap between what they expected it to output and what it outputted. And that gap between their expectation and the result is what we could play with through our design choices. Yeah, so I think the way forward on it would be that the prompts are used for the people's own memory recall, and actually they should not be seen as definitive representations themselves. And interestingly, like different people realized that other people had remembered similar things when they saw something similar being generated. They'd be like, you remember that guy too? He would always pull the cart full of cardboard. Oh yeah, I remember that too, right? And it happened with people of similar ages. And interestingly, it even happened with people across the generations. Of similar phenomena happening like 30 years ago and last week. It kind of makes you realize that in some ways, what's going on outside the Blue House didn't change that much for the people who were witnessing it. And then what we did is the last step is we made the website, bluehouse.ai. So whatever people generated in there, once they approved it, it would go on the website. And then the general public could also make their own panoramas and download it and add their own. Then we installed the storybook in their museum, in their house of stories. And then also gave them access to the website so they could display it on their museum monitor so that they could even show, these are the images that we generated together about how we want to be remembered as a community. And this is what we got. This is advertisement for the exhibition we had, some documentation on my website, and the paper that I published about the system design component. So thank you all very much. And this is my IG, Finding the Found Photo, and welcome to questions.